valuable to your career. My original plan was to show you guys some of my slideshow that I used last week teaching about environment and sustainability, and Trevor was like, no slides. So I'll just talk to you a little bit about my perspective from anthropology, which is traditionally the study of how humans around the world make a living, how we survive, how we find meaning in life, how we pass through the various stages of growing up and learning to be a human, and how that varies from one community to the next in very important ways. So when it comes to climate change, this is something that every human being faces and will increasingly face in the future. But the sad thing is that many of the communities that will be most harmed by climate change, most directly affected, are not the communities that have done most of the job of creating the problem that we are now facing. I mean, that's a justice issue, right? It's primarily the wealthier northern and western countries that have basically passed through this industrial revolution. We enjoy a lifestyle where we can all drive to campus and consume our coffee from Guatemala and Brazil. You know, our consumer goods that we purchase a new version every couple of years, and we're very accustomed to that. But there's an entire giant supply chain, which we keep hearing about, right, recently, that makes those things possible. Our consumption basically is what contributes the most harm to our global environment, not only directly through climate change, but also through just exhausting resources that cannot be easily replaced. This is why we are now trying to mine the deep seas and find new deposits of oil and various minerals. We even have companies that are trying to figure out how to mine asteroids, right? Because there's actually enough profit because we're running out of essential ingredients like lithium that we need for our lifestyles. Meanwhile, the countries that face the greatest threat from climate change are the ones who are still just trying to provide a basic quality of life to their citizens, where many of the population still live in poverty or even extreme poverty, and where there isn't a lot of consumption, not because they don't want to consume, right? They want to have middle-class lifestyles too, but because they don't have the wealth to make that possible. So one of our challenges, right, is we have these competing problems. We want the world to be more fair. We want more people to be able to live in peace, to be able to have a middle-class lifestyle. But at the same time that they're increasingly gaining that, we're running out of stuff. We're running out of the raw materials. We're running out of breathing room to lower those temperatures before we cook the planet. So our problem, and this really is a problem that I think we in the United States and other wealthy countries are really going to have to take the lead on, is figuring out how to make climate change not a problem for future equality, but an opportunity to try and make things a little bit more fair worldwide. And that's going to require us figuring out how to live more sustainably. And fortunately, we can find plenty of examples of how to do that. It's really only in the past century or so that our country has become so unsustainable. We can look around the world, we can look at our own history, we can look at how our pioneer ancestors were able to make do with a lot less. And the good news is that basically requires slowing down a little bit, which we kind of saw during the pandemic, right? If you were stuck indoors, not traveling a lot, life got a little bit slower. So if we can incorporate that into our daily lives, make a living in a little bit more peaceful, easygoing manner, that would be great for us and for the planet.
Should I go ahead?
Okay. All right. All right, I'll go. We're going to arm wrestle to see who goes next. So I'm Charlie Mitchell. I'm a professor of American Studies here. Unlike Doc, there actually is no program in American Studies, so it leaves me with a kind of identity crisis. But I teach a lot of courses in history. Some of you have had the misfortune of being in one or two of them with me before. And in particular, for about 15, 20 years, I've been teaching a variety of courses in environmental history. I first started doing that back in 1997, and I was drawn to the field of environmental history largely by the sort of bread and butter issues of old style environmental conservation, right? National parks, cool, wilderness preservation. Let's go hiking, right? Let's go camping and backpacking. Let's set aside more land for recreation. Let's have more endangered species protections and all those kinds of things that had been part of what I think we can refer to, borrowing a term from women's movement, as first wave environmentalism. And over the course of the 20 some odd years that I've been involved in teaching courses like that, the discipline, the approach has changed significantly. One little sort of convenient illustration, I had been involved in academic organizations have national, or academic fields have national organizations. There's a, I don't know, National Association of Anthropologists, there's an American Studies Association, an American Historical Association, and a bunch of old boring professors get together once a year and they read papers to one another. They then skip one another's panels to go out to the bars, but we don't have to talk too much about that. But I was part of a group in the American Studies Association that started off calling itself the Environmental Studies Caucus. So it was people in the organization who were interested in the environment. And that has changed its name twice in the 25 years that I've been there. It first changed its name to the Environment and Culture Caucus as a way of talking a little bit more about cultural expressions of environmental ideas. And 5 years ago, its name was changed to the Environmental Justice Caucus, seeing that as sort of a logical, natural evolution of the focus and the interest and the intention of the discipline, right? Issues of the equitable access to all those great things like national parks and wilderness areas, issues of whose land became the national parks or those national wilderness areas. The story that I cherish and value because I love going to Yosemite and Glacier and Yellowstone and all the other wonderful places out west is that those lands had originally been part of Native American territory. Many of them were taken from Native American tribes in violation of treaties in order to set up the national parks themselves. So there is always a deeper, more socially significant and engaged side to a lot of those fun aspects of environmentalism that I enjoyed. In the last several years, I've turned my attention, or I guess added to my attention, to be interested in climate history, the history of how climate has changed and shaped human societies over time, which I think is maybe what I bring to what I'm most interested in here. And in particular, how those climate patterns, the little ice age of the 12, 13, and 1400s, or something that historians call the Roman climate, and Jo Mahoney knows this, the Roman climate optimum, which is a period of about 250 years in the very early part of the Common Era, in which the climate in the Mediterranean was perfectly suited for all sorts of extensions of agriculture. But I just got to Rome. That's like thousands. No, and how those shaped the development of human societies, and how later changes in directions that were less than optimum shaped human societies, and how those societies historically adapted to those changes. Right. I mean, one of the things we want to talk about is how we address and minimize the impacts of climate change. Another thing we can talk about is how societies can organize to demonstrate their resilience and their means of adjusting. So thank you. Look forward to conversations.
Okay. I'm Mary Jo Mahoney. I'm an associate professor of English. I'm the director of medical humanities minor here at Elmira College. In building up the material for medical humanities, one sort of sub area in the discipline is about the ethical treatment of animals inside science and medical research. And from there, I kind of went off into this whole other direction of animal advocacy. And with my class, many of you are here today, at my composition class of all things, we were using just the theme of the complicated relationship between humans and animals to just have a subject matter in order to develop writing skills. And in the process, came across many research articles, but also this text called Eating Animals, Jonathan Safran Foer, a novelist from Brooklyn. And in this, he provides a whole lot of research and data. And so, a couple bits of his data and research stopped me in my tracks. And I'll get to what this has to do with sustainability in just a second. But so he says, in a footnote on a chapter heading, just right here, this teeny little text, he says, animal agriculture makes a 40% greater contribution to global warming than all transportation in the world combined. It is the #1 cause of climate change. Animal agriculture. Now, he doesn't mean, you know, your grandfather's farm. He means corporate factory farming. All the big names that you see in the supermarkets, Tyson, even fast food industries like McDonald's, that they have these corporate factory farming practices that are so systematized that the animals are raised in such a way that their lifespan is controlled to being as short as possible, and using things like chemicals and things, hormones, things like that, to enhance, say, the weight of the animal under inhumane conditions. So for instance, what do I mean by that? You see the square on these pages? In the typical cage for egg-laying hens, each bird has 67 square inches of space, the size of this rectangle. So the life of the bird is spent inside a space this big, right? And it goes on and on. Now, we have many documentaries that show the inside of these factories that just make you unable to look. You have to look away. And so this created a whole other set of interests of mine about the ethical treatment of animals that has to do with our meat consumption. Our meat consumption. And yet it's with the exploitation of these animals that we serve our own sort of blind consumption of meat. The animal agriculture industry, again, the second leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, second to fossil fuels, is one major contributor to climate change. And we do it in such a way, human behavior sets up to exploit animals for us to just be able to eat. Now, granted, the flip side is that there are 7.8 billion people in the world and people have to eat. But I think the push for more regulations and controls on how these animals are farmed and treated is something that is so complex and deep that we need conscious advocacy in order to make changes like this. So that's why I'm here. Okay.
Do they have one of the books we could read from?
Um, I think I'm hearing something very faint. Are you are you ready for me to speak?
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, if you could speak, please.
Yep.
Yes.
Great,
Okay.
thank-
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from my home office here in Trumansburg, New York. And I'm very happy to be with you. I'm a biologist. And for me as a biologist, environmental justice has kind of two signature issues. One is inequality in opportunities to participate in environmental decision making. I'm working with a community right now in Colorado, for example, where oil and gas industry has decided to choose a Latino community to set up its extraction operations, in part because there are many undocumented people living there and who are terrified of deportation. And so the chances that they will be showing up to decisions, public hearings about where this kind of decisions are made about whether to allow, permit, prohibit, or regulate this are less than it would be in a white community. And then the second kind of signature issue of environmental justice from the work that I do is uneven impacts of environmental hazards along racial and socioeconomic lines. So these Black, brown, indigenous, rural, white, poor communities are targeted by oil and gas extraction operations to serve as their basis of operations. But there's another form of environmental injustice that I want to mention, and that's what we call generational inequity. So I'm 62 years old, and I want to speak now to the young people in the audience. Environmental justice means that your generation is going to pay a terrible price for political and economic decisions made by people in my generation, the consequences of which are going to be felt disproportionately by you, but you are not going to have been able to participate in the kind of prosperity that was very temporary. And that's another form of environmental justice. So essentially how I came to do this work, and I look at the harm caused by oil and gas extraction and combustion, which is the number one reason that we're facing climate calamity. We have now, the science is very clear, we have about 8 years or so to completely decarbonize and move our economy off of burning fossil fuels and onto renewable energy before we hit what we call runaway tipping points in ecology, by which we mean points of no return, after which no matter how quickly we build solar panels, we can't stop kind of these progressive destabilizing events that will eventually, for example, harm the plankton in the ocean, which provide us more than half of the oxygen we breathe. And once we hit that tipping point, then that's when we say climate crisis is an existential crisis, we mean that parts of the ecosystem that bring us things that are necessary for our life, oxygen, pollinators to provide us food, that these guys are in trouble. So my work began as a kind of rank and file ecologist who took a systems approach to ecology. And I was just doing my regular biology work out in the field when I discovered, doing my dissertation work, that pesticides had been sprayed in this apparently virgin, pristine forest, and that the records of that spraying project actually were hidden. And I uncovered them kind of accidentally. And those were pesticides actually that had been also sprayed in Vietnam, so-called Agent Orange, and that I myself may have been exposed to those things. And so I then kind of changed my biology to understand that we needed to document these things and I felt like the first step was public awareness, and that the next step would be activism. But then I moved here to New York, where I practiced biology, and I became a co-founder of New Yorkers Against Fracking. So when the oil and gas industry came here to New York to use our bedrock to stage their operations, I began to realize that science in some cases is too slow to stop things that we know are harmful. The wheels of scientific proof-making grind very slowly. And so sometimes activism has to precede science, and the activism itself is a way of raising awareness, and then it opens a space for science to speak. So I've sort of changed my life a little bit. I no longer am a university scientist. I now work as a senior scientist for the Science and Environmental Health Network, where we bring good science to communities who are doing activism to stop the oil and gas industry. And I have been a civil disobedient, going to jail for blockading and using my body to physically stop oil and gas. So if you're interested in that kind of direct action, I'm happy to talk about that, as well as the science of climate. So thank you for letting me be part of this conversation today.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Matt, what do you guys think is the most impactful way to kind of lessen the impact of
The question was, what do we panelists think is the most impactful way that we can lessen the harms that we're causing to the environment?
I'm happy to give it a shot, but not just from my own perspective. I think education is super important. Just understanding that there is a problem in certain circles. I feel the way we appropriate our funds, for instance, reinforcing the non-fossil fuel industries, making it tougher on the fossil fuel industries to do business as usual, at least stop the subsidies there, and send some sort of funding to those countries that are going to be most affected, the marginalized countries on the coastlands and on the islands. Maybe come up with ways for new sustainable farming. I don't know, that there are so many options, but to encourage anything that would help us further our transition.
I think another sort of, and this builds on what you just said, is, and this can be more difficult than it sounds, is a general level of self-awareness. And I don't mean like, who are you and what do you want out of your life, right? But an awareness of how all of those things that are part of our everyday existence connect us to a lot of those environmental concerns indirectly, right? I mean, Doc showed his phone, and I can show mine. It's smaller, I'm older, I'm surprised I can use it, right? But where does this come from? What goes into producing this, creating this? Sometimes that level of self-awareness and knowledge can be actually somewhat crippling, because when you reflect upon all of the different ways in which, when I reflect upon all the different ways in which I'm implicit or complicit with many things, right? It can be a bit overwhelming. There's not a lot I can do about certain things, but seeing those connections and those tie-ins with other parts of the world, where your lithium is coming from in your phone, that in the batteries that run the phone, right? Where your corn or your bacon for your breakfast meal come from. That's a good start, right? Because at least there's an awareness then of our individual responsibilities for those things. And that's where we can begin talking about, okay, what can I do about what I know, right? The big stuff is sometimes too easy, right? Oh, let's recycle, right? Or let's take shorter showers. All of those are important, but it's kind of the systemic piece, I think, that's critical.
Yeah, I guess I want to build on that. It is a systemic problem. And from my point of view, we're not going to shop our way out of this crisis. And I actually don't care what you eat. I don't care what you wear. I don't care what you buy. This is an emergency, and it's a political emergency, right? So we have 8 years to decarbonize. And that means that we have to disentangle our government from its current kind of, it's being held hostage right now to big oil and gas. So this is not a problem that we can solve through self-reflection or through spiritual practices or buying anything different. This is a problem that we have to act as citizen activists. And that requires organizing, and insisting that our government serve us and give us different choices. I think that's doable. And I think we proved that's doable here in New York when the oil and gas industry came to our state and we had a mass mobilization. It required, in some cases, civil disobedience, but we did kick oil and gas out of New York. So fracking is banned here in New York, which was thought to be impossible. So it was a David and Goliath fight. And I think when you have David and Goliath fights and you go up against the biggest corporations in the world, which is the oil and gas industry, then you have to think about you have to be strategic and think about what your slingshot is if you're the Davids, right? And essentially, I think it is science, love, and grassroots political power. And so building that political power is what we need to do. And I'm really glad that the youth are kind of leading the way on this. So the Sunrise Movement, I think, is the youth-based movement, kind of arm of the climate justice movement that I am also involved with. And I see that is getting more traction than anything else. So, I mean, I'm speaking to you in a kind of a humble way, not as an expert, but to say that it's not fair that your generation is paying the biggest price. It's an environmental injustice for you. And you should not have to be the ones leading the charge on the political organizing that's required. But that's how it's working out. So I just kind of pledge myself as an older person to support that movement in whatever way I can.
Yeah, you guys should get fired up. This is
They are
not-
fired up. They are. It's us that the old people need to get fired up.
I'm wondering, something that Dr. Charlotte said, and it's someone who has looked at history for a long time. It struck me that Charlie mentioned that during the Roman period, that climate had a very favorable conditions in the ancient world and the pre-industrial world. The economy is based on almost 90%. And there are times when there are favorable conditions in the environment that really very much help the economy. And then Charlie mentioned that before the Black Death, where the Black Plague hits Europe, experiences this right? Because of that, the European populations are weakened because of lack of food that really factors that really constrains European millions. It's half of Europe. The one thing that the Industrial Revolution brings us is almost this creation, right? And this creation of this hedge against that starvation. And while the Industrial Revolution is dominant in the North and the West, I guess what I'm asking the panel, what think about this sort of climate justice? What about sort of the justice of where we have other countries that are trying to kind of work out an industrial race and advance their own economies. They have no starvation, or they get things like phones. What, at least for us in the Western and Northern cultures, we take advantage of these phones and pay the price for this, and other folks pay the price for it. How do we ask those other countries not to have the sins that go, but also reap the benefits from it?
So to sort of paraphrase very quickly the question, how do we increase equality? How do we ask countries that are still trying to proceed through their own industrial revolutions and provide a middle-class lifestyle to their citizens to avoid some of the problems that we've created in our own history?
They've got to answer, right? Isn't that, I mean,
This is on the quiz.
yeah. This is, I'm just going to say, I mean, that is the $64 billion question, right? Because another way to frame that, and I have no solution for it, right? But another way to frame that is, can you ask the however many billions of people who live in India not to develop and adapt air conditioning, because that's only going to make global warming worse, right? We're sitting in a climate controlled room. Some of us may be more or less comfortable, right? That's a standard, a norm that's not even part of what we think about. And in the West or in the North, the Northern. And so it's not even so much phones, but those kinds of basic kind of infrastructure things, right? Yep. Right, exactly. Right. I mean, the Industrial Revolution produced surpluses in agricultural product that would be part of the resilience of society struggling with localized famines, right? And where does that, where does that go? And I think that's a very hard question, because if I have 80% of the pie and Mary Jo has 20% of the pie,
I'm gonna be mad.
you're going to be mad, and you want more than 20% of the pie. And if we're at a point in where making a bigger pie just makes more problems, how is Mary Jo going to get more pie? I've got to give her some, right? I've got to share, or you've got to take it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think historically, that's the big thing, is that the folks who have, and this is oversimplifying, but who have come out on the bottom of those periodic climate changes in the past have not sat around and said, oh, well, bummer, right? We're losing our homes, or we can't feed ourselves. They get up and they move and they go looking, right? They become refugees, climate refugees. And they look at the 80% of the pie and say, sorry, right? That's not fair. And if only from a perspective of self-interest, it might be a good idea for me to share. She's looking at me the way she looks at me. It might be a good idea for me to share some of my pie with my good friend, Dr. Mahoney, right? But that's hard to think about at a global scale.
So how do you?
Well, in fact, I mean, I think that's right. The fact that, but we have been thinking about those things, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Committee on Parties that gave us the Paris Climate Accords, it took 21 years to figure out a plan, right? But there is a plan in place, a global plan, which is that wealthier nations bear a disproportionate responsibility to help underdeveloped nations leap over the necessity to go through a fossil fuel era and move right into the kinds of technologies that we know work that don't rely on fossil fuels. So that's actually kind of been worked out already on a global scale, and now it's a matter of implementing it. So India, for example, just this week is announcing, because it has a fertilizer shortage. You might know that. I think I heard one of the speakers say that big ag plays a role in the climate crisis, and it does, and it's in part because we feed industrially raised animals grains that are grown with anhydrous ammonia fertilizer, which is a petrochemical, right? So the fertilizer that we use to grow animal food comes from oil and gas. And so India is realizing that it can create fertilizer in another way using so-called green hydrogen. Otherwise, the source of hydrogen comes from methane. And so by switching over to renewably created fertilizer, then that's kind of kicks off one leg of the fossil fuel stool and begins that process of decarbonizing. And similarly, throughout the continent of Africa, for example, we see electrification efforts that skip over oil and gas. I just want to make sure that you know this is all possible. Like, I'm talking to you from my own house, which I keep at a really comfortable 74 degrees because I get cold easily. And I have heat pumps working right now that are electric, that are being driven by fossil fuels, heating my homes. And I can also use them to cool my home in the summer. And so there's a whole battle going on right now about whether, for example, we can free Europe from its dependency on Russian oil and gas, the petrostate that is Russia, which is how it's doing what it's doing in the Ukraine, by essentially providing heat pumps that are electrified and can run on renewable energy to Europe. This is a doable project. So it's a matter of scaling that up. And it's a matter of insisting that real energy independence means independence from fossil fuels. So this is a conversation that's happening globally right now. And it is possible to develop places that don't have electricity by completely skipping over fossil fuels and bringing them heat pumps and bringing them fertilizers that aren't sourced from fossil fuels. This is a doable project.
I can tell you what's happening in medical schools across the United States, especially the top tier medical schools. And that is that medical schools are changing their missions to be very, very consciously and very, very actively pro diversity, inclusion, and equity. And in the process, they are diversifying their incoming classes across all sorts of demographics and trying to build up people who were born into lives that are fundamentally more difficult than others. And same thing could be happening in workplaces and institutions, but it takes the people who are paying tuition to gather together and voice wants and needs and values. And so there has to be a more active kind of advocacy for things that are just and right. And the other comment I wanted to make was that not only is animal agriculture a big component of the deterioration of our environment, but it's also making us unhealthy as people because of the additives in, whether it's from the food or whether it's from directly administering artificial chemicals or artificial things to these animals, or whether we are stressing them to the point that then their hormone levels are completely out of flux. And then we consume this food, we're contributing to our own declining health. We know that our children in the United States, generally speaking, are way too big. And children are going through puberty at a much younger age, in part because of the hormones in the milk. So all of these things overlap and are intricately connected. And it takes conscious effort to say, I'm going to do my part to stop this, and perhaps find a community of people who take action, not just in ideals, but in action. So.
Question. It's kind of a natural cycle. I assume you do young fixated on that.
there's scientific research that says, yeah, I mean, I do know that if water comes down and it gets big, that it runs off and creeks and rivers rise and fall at not natural levels. Up and down. Is there any possible, like, can I speak to the legislative part of that, like just local and local governments, regional governments, national governments, researching that? I don't know. Those kinds of things that have more regulation. I'm just trying to mall and certain area. It's just like I do. There's just grass there, you know. So that's kind of something.
Recently, the state has funding for green infrastructure, billions of dollars to do just that, to encourage the porous there are different types of parking lots, of course, and there's the kind that's that has pores built into it. There's parking surfaces that are made from old tires. And so the green infrastructure bill was passed, and there are monies available for our area. And the grants give us preference. A large part of the census tract in Chemung County, in Elmira and Elmira Heights, qualify us for more monies because we have 25% of our population living in with poverty and are environmentally compromised. We're part of the big maps for disadvantaged communities that make us eligible. So the money is coming slowly. With Biden coming in, 40% of his money is to go towards environmental justice issues. Probably somebody else could name that more specifically than I can.
Folks, we're almost out of time for this panel, but I think one of the key takeaways, as Sandra was saying, is this is all possible. We have the technology, we have a plan, we know what to do. It's just a matter of political follow through. You have to be fired up, you have to get your elected leaders to keep their promises, to not distract you with all sorts of cultural issues, but focus on the big picture. Because we are living in a climate emergency, and time is running out. So we don't have time to dilly-dally and get distracted. We need to focus on what we can do. And if we do it well, this means that you get to grow up and have a family that is healthy in the most important ways. You have free time and entertainment, all the things you value. There will still be bread and circuses, but we can also potentially live in a much more fair and equitable and peaceful world. So see this crisis as an opportunity and try to make the best of it.